call the meeting to order. All right, would you please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, moving on. All right, moving on to operational tasks. I believe we do not have minutes yet for the last meeting, so we will hopefully get those shortly. I do understand that we had missed one item of business in November, which was to nominate the chair. I was the chair from the last cycle, and while I'm happy to do that, if there was any other nominations, I believe, Russ, you were going to make those?
I was, and actually I was just going to open up the floor for nominations at that point. And I do believe procedurally we need at least one nomination.
I'd love to nominate Chris to continue in his role. He's doing a fabulous job.
All right, we have a nomination.
Seth. I accept your nomination. All right, well, it was a hard-fought battle, but I accept the nomination, and I guess we'll move forward. Thank you all for being here this evening. Next order of business is to establish meeting beginning and ending times as necessary. So this meeting is scheduled for, I believe, 7 until 9 p.m. The process that we've normally done is to extend that in 15-minute increments. So if the conversation is needing to go past 9 o'clock, we will need a formal motion to extend it for 15 minutes and then 15 minutes thereafter. So unless anybody has any concerns with that, we'll go ahead and use that process going forward. All right, seeing none, we're moving on. And the next item up for, and I did see that there was an updated agenda, although it looked a little similar to the one that we had, but that new agenda does have the superintendent's budget message. So Superintendent Goff, the floor is yours. Oh, I'm sorry, Russell?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, we did miss one item on there, which was to review the proposed dates and edit to the budget committee calendar. It's item 2.
Okay, I'm sorry. Oh, yes. That's sorry. Item 2, I skipped right past it. So yeah, let's go back to that. Go ahead, Russ.
So, Mr. Chair, members of the board, we did end up having a scheduling conflict with the current calendar. The revised calendar was sent out in an email shortly before this meeting. The crux of the matter is we had to move the June 14th meeting because the school board had to move their meetings, and moving the budget committee meeting, or the board hearing on the budget back to the 7th of June caused us to also need to move the what was the previously scheduled May 26th meeting back to May 24th. We need that additional space to make sure that we can do the legal and appropriate public notifications. So with that, I would recommend a motion and approval on the updated calendar.
All right, everybody clear on the new dates? Hopefully that doesn't create any challenges for anybody. I'd entertain a motion to approve the new budget calendar dates.
Motion to approve the calendar as presented.
All right, is there a second? I'm sorry, who was that second? I didn't catch that.
Second.
Oh, thank you, Seth. All right, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Was that an opposition or was that just a late in favor?
It was a late in favor. I didn't get into my mute button fast enough.
Okay, yeah, sorry, I'll give folks a little bit of extra time. I'm still getting used to this environment. So, okay, so with that, thank you for calling my attention to that, Russ. Now we are back to the superintendent's budget message. So, Superintendent Goff.
Thank you so much. So I am going to read to you tonight the budget message for this school year. And I think it's important to read it into the record, especially for those who may be viewing from home. So community. It is what makes the Greater Albany School District greater. It is what makes our celebrations so joyful. It is what brings us comfort during times of struggle. Where we were. The spring of 2020 found us completing a 9-month strategic planning process involving unprecedented community engagement, particularly of students and parents who have been historically marginalized in planning our educational future. On March 12th, 2020, we were on the cusp of building the details on the district plan itself, which would focus on academic rigor, social, emotional, and mental health, and equitable practices across all aspects of our learning system. On March 13th, 2020, we turned off the lights at the Gap School District office for what we thought might be several days. We had no idea that as a school community, we were about to face the greatest challenge of our lives. The COVID-19 pandemic altered just about everything we knew about how we do things. We used to communicate in small groups, hanging around the coffee maker, the copier, or our lockers to talk about how we spent the night before or the adventures planned for our day of learning. Suddenly, we were in various states of isolation, communicating primarily via text, email, phone, and these unfamiliar tools called Google Chat and Zoom. We used to greet each other in the morning with big smiles and high fives, with an occasional hug for those most special to us. We instead found ourselves in isolation, except for when we ventured out for groceries or other needed items. We failed to immediately recognize friends as we could only see their eyes and their hair due to the masks covering their visages. Our greetings became fist bumps and muffled hellos. With these changes in our way of being together, we had growing concerns about student physical and mental health. Were students getting the meals they needed? Were they feeling connected with others? Were they exercising or even spending time out of the house at all? Where we are. COVID-19 affects our health. It is changing lives and families, sometimes irrevocably. It also tests our sense of community. As educators, students, parents, and partners, we thrive when we come together in a safe place where we can challenge each other and be challenged ourselves to be better. That is exactly what we have done. With the support of our incredible community partners and our Greater Albany community, we have served over 500,000 meals to students, supplied masks for every student and staff member, provided childcare to parents and staff in need, closed the technology gap through a one-to-one device deployment to our students and supporting their access to internet services from home, created protocols and sanitized facilities for student returns, and provided transportation of meals and student supplies so that we can provide these services to students in their homes when they cannot come to us. We added new instructional models and provided choices to students so that parents could navigate their own comfort levels with their students returning to in-person school. We embraced flexible learning, and we embarked on a distance and hybrid learning journey together as a community. Where we are going. This budget is a celebration. It contemplates a full return to school, hopefully in fall 2021. For all of us at GAPS, it means getting back to what we really want to do, moving forward on our 3 major commitments to our students, families, and community, and building bridges to lifelong learning and brighter futures. As a community, we're doing our best to create a safe and challenging place. The art of education is to recognize that learners need both. Denying either one to a budding learner usually doesn't end well. Learners who feel unsafe struggle to react productively to challenges. Learners who are not challenged struggle to reach their potential. The rest of this document explains the nuts and bolts of next year's budget. Although the general fund still suffers from chronic shortfalls, some increased permanent and temporary grant funding allows us to do some exciting new things for learners. Read on or learn on to learn more about our well thought out investments and the approach we are taking to ensure our hopes for our students are realized right here in our community. You'll find in this budget document that the investments that, well, first the areas that we were able to protect within the budget allow for us to keep moving forward in a flexible manner, which has also been a priority to us, to walk away after the pandemic, not reverting back to how education was prior to the pandemic, but taking advantage of what we've learned and the opportunities of experience that we've had together as we've walked through this. So what can we take away from flexibility that will strengthen how students learn and their opportunities to learn inside and outside of the classroom? This budget not only protects the investments that we need to have in place in order to retain that flexibility, but it also adds investments to chronically underfunded areas within our budget. We have not had elementary counselors for a long time in Greater Albany Public Schools, and we are right now interviewing for those positions to start next year. And that is a huge celebration for us to have a counselor in every elementary school. Thank you, Director Aganaga. I see you clapping. It definitely is worth the clap for sure. We also, and that is a commitment to our social emotional mental health supports. We have contracts that we are negotiating next year with agencies such as Lynn County Mental Health to increase the number of mental health therapists that are bicultural and bilingual, so that more of our students will see people who look like them, who can talk to them about sensitive issues. We, within this budget, have resources to shrink class size for our earliest learners. So we're currently hiring kindergarten and first grade teachers. And one of the celebrations I'll share with you is our Director of Elementary Education, Sue Luther, shared with us this week that she is embarrassed by the riches of people who want to come to GAPS right now to teach our kindergarten and first grade students, that we have more fantastic candidates than we even have openings for shrinking those class sizes. So that's a pretty, it's actually kind of a surprising place to be in, because a lot of people don't feel comfortable leaving their districts right now during the pandemic. And so it has to be a very attractive district for you to leave the district you're safe and secure in right now and take the risk of moving to a different system. And so to have these high caliber candidates wanting to come to us is a really strong reflection, I think, of how our community has protected our schools and prioritized our schools and wrapped around our schools through this episode, through this pandemic. And then you'll see a number of investments as well that are marked out in our student investment account plan, which is included in your packet as well, behind Director Scherzinger's information. Those investments are also designed to address some of the inequities that we have had within our system. So making sure that we are looking at our policies and practices and procedures across our entire system and addressing areas of concern. These investments were ones that we had hoped, many of these were investments we had hoped to be able to make a year ago. And then with the pandemic, we simply weren't able to. The monies that we anticipated coming in did not come in. And then there were other, with the money that did come in, needed to be invested elsewhere for us to address the needs of students and families. So this is a really exciting budget to be able to present to you. And I'm excited to answer any questions that you have later. Thank you.
All right. So it sounds like maybe later on the questions, Superintendent Goff, unless people have something specific now that even though you haven't seen the budget.
That would be great. Thanks.
Okay.
I have to say, I'm
So
excited. I'm excited for that you're excited about the budget, because for as long as we've sat on the committee, I don't think I've ever heard such enthusiasm. So that's my.
One of the things I failed to mention is this budget also, one of the fail forward learnings out of the pandemic is comprehensive distance learning doesn't work for every kid, but it certainly does work for some of our students. And so we definitely have families who prefer for us to continue to offer comprehensive distance learning as an option for their children. And this budget does that. So it does not offer the distance learning that you're used to right now, which is from every single school having distance learning, but allows us as a district to have a distance learning strand so that teachers who, fifth grade teachers who are experienced fifth grade teachers are conducting class with fifth grade students via Zoom in very much the same manner as distance learning is happening currently today. And and we would still continue to have AOL. So that adds a whole different option for our students and their families, and we feel like that's going to be an asset in the long run.
Great. So it looks like the next thing on the agenda is the financial update and a presentation of the budget highlights from Director Scherzinger.
Good evening. Before I start that, because I actually have a PowerPoint, Michelle said I had to have or Melissa said I had to have a PowerPoint.
Tradition.
And so I have one. But and I think what that PowerPoint's going to do is going to go through essentially the same material as the text, my 4 or 5 pages of text that you have in the budget. So you don't really have to take notes. You can just read the 4 or 5 pages. The other thing about this budget, before I get into the PowerPoint, is to recognize that we built this. It may look very similar to the budgets you've had before, but we've really built it on a computer model that we've had access to at the ESD before, and other districts use to do budgets. And we used partially to do the budget before, but this time we've done it entirely on using that model. And you'll at some point maybe hear some quirk that happened because of that. But even more importantly, what it allows you to do is you can ask all kinds of complicated questions now, because now we can go in and do a little bit of programming and answer the question in a more comprehensive way. So it's certainly, once you get it all set up right, you can do all kinds of combinations that would be very difficult to do if you were trying to do it on a bunch of different spreadsheets. So feel free to ask questions, and we will be able to get back to you. Sometimes that's what it'll take with an answer. Let me see if I can get this PowerPoint up, so I can never know how to. I have to share screen, right? Let's see, and here, right here. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
All right, so this is the presentation on the 21-22 proposed budget for Greater Albany Public Schools. And the first section is the fiscal situation. I promise this is the only complicated table I'm going to give you. And the board has seen it before. I think it's changed a little bit in the numbers, but the message is still the same. And I want to spend a little bit of time on it, because I think understanding that the box you're working in is really the key of doing a budget. If you see what the boundaries are, then it's easier to see what choices you have to make. So first thing on this table, this is a general fund, and it's just a very simple comparison of resources and requirements. And then when we get into the projection part of it into next year, the shortfall that we might expect under a set of reasonable assumptions. That's the whole logic of the table. And these are all millions of dollars in this table. So let's just start at on resources. So resources, virtually all of our ongoing revenue is determined by the state school fund. Even this beginning balance, most of that came from prior state school fund allocations. So that really is what drives our revenue. And what that is the state, ever since the passage of the property tax limits back in 1990, developed a formula that captures the state appropriation for schools, the local property, the regular local property taxes of schools, and some other dedicated revenue sources, and sort of aggregated them all in one pool, and then reallocates those resources by a formula largely based on a weighted student count. So what that means for districts is that your revenue is primarily driven by how fast property taxes are rising statewide, which is relatively slowly, 3 to 4% a year because of the tax limitations for the regular school property taxes, and how much the state appropriates into that pool. In fact, that state appropriation is, I think it's something like 60% of the total. It's a huge percentage of the total. And what our enrollment count is. Well, what happened with the pandemic is that when school started this year, we had about 1,000 kids that didn't show up in their local brick and mortar school. About 600 went to Albany Online, so they still get counted, but about 400 didn't show up at all. And so the big question going into this year, if we start school back in a full mode of in-person schooling, is how many of those kids will show up on the first day of school. And this chart here compares 3 different assumptions about that. The first assumption, which I called the official enrollment estimate, and I call it that because that's the number that we gave the state some time ago, and they're using in the projections of state school fund revenue, the official projections of state school fund revenue. Those are the numbers they're using for us. And under that assumption for enrollment, it's about half of the 400 kids that, all of the AOL kids, they're still in school, but largely back in brick and mortar schools. And then about half of the 400 that are missing come back to school. That's what that assumption is based on. Another assumption is the December estimate. That's one that was kind of done right before I got here. I came in January. And that one has about 300 of the 400 coming back. And the third one, that pre-COVID estimate, that's the estimate that the demographer did for 21. I still didn't fix that 21. It should be 21-22, not 21-20. That the demographer did for 21-22 before we even knew about COVID. So that's like returning to a full school as if nothing had happened, an estimate. And you can see it makes a significant difference in the amount of state school fund revenue we would get. Under that sort of official enrollment estimate, 95.6 million, 96.7 under the December estimate. So 100 kids means about $1 million, and 98.7 under the pre-COVID estimate, which makes a big difference. Notice too, somebody will ask this, so I'm just going to answer it right now. That's a decline from the amount of state school fund revenue we're going to get this year. And the reason for that is that the way the formula works, that the first year your enrollment drops, you're protected. You get to use the prior year's count, even though your enrollment dropped this year. So we're still using the 2019-20 enrollment, weighted enrollment, to determine our revenue in 2021. But that sort of protection goes away in 21-22. And that's why it drops, because now we're actually using that lower enrollment estimate, or ADMW, or weighted enrollment estimate, in 21-22. And the other reason is this chart assumes the state appropriation of 9.1 billion that's in the governor. It's the number that's in the governor's budget. It's in the co-chair's budget. Of course, there's a lot of political discussion of a higher number, but this is assuming the 9.1 appropriation. And that's in a year over year, the way the legislature does it, the year over year growth in the appropriation from 2021 to 21-22 is only 1%. So you're not putting that much more in the appropriation, and our enrollment is dropping. And so the number actually goes down, is really what's happening there. Obviously, the appropriation could be higher in the end, and that would benefit the district. So that's the resource side of it. On the requirement side, 90% of our expenditures are really the salaries and benefits of our staff. And so they really drive the, what those happens to those costs really drive the budget. This chart starts with a base assumption, which is that, first of all, lower PERS rates. The PERS rates are going down, and we know what they are. So that's a significant savings to the district next year. In fact, we're in the return in PERS actually exceeded their assumed rate even last year. So that gives us some hope that those rates will stay down for a while. Of course, we got another whole year of earnings to determine what happens in the future, but they will at least stay down at the rate they are now for 2 years. So that's incorporated into these numbers. The second thing incorporated in there is a step for each staff person that's eligible for a step. So if they're not at the top of their step schedule, then they'll get a step under these assumptions, and a $50 increase in the healthcare cap, the cap on how much we pay for healthcare. And when you use those assumptions, you get 93.4 million for the existing staff for next year. That's under this. That's if there's no COLA. If you paid a 2% COLA, that goes up to 94.8 million. And so when you then process these all the way through, you get a range of shortfalls for next year of anywhere from a somewhat slight surplus to down to the lowest one is a $4 million deficit. And the other assumption that was in here is that we maintain reserves at the same budgeted level as they were in 2021 of $8 million in all of the assumptions. So this is the shortfall estimate there. So this is the box we're in. We have a shortfall under most assumptions in the general fund, and that's one of the things that we need to deal with in order to balance the budget. So I think it's important enough. If you have any questions about this, just jump in and ask me now. If you have a question, then somebody else probably does, and they're just too shy to ask. So if you have any questions about this, jump in, or otherwise
Jim,
I'll go on.
Jim, a question I have on the look at the shortfall and the ending balance. So just to make sure I'm understanding. So the first column on 21-22 official enrollment estimate, where it has the ending balance of 8, which is 2.7 less than what we project it's going to end. And then there's a shortfall at 2.5. So is that telling me that we're going to eat into the contingency 2.7 and still be 2.5 short to attain that? Or
well, yeah, I see the question. What typically happens is that we build in a contingency or an ending balance of 8 million, and when it actually, by the end, what actually turns up is a little bit more than that, because you never spend every nickel you budget to spend. And so you typically come in at the end of the period of time, which we're projecting to happen again this year, Of course, this now is only a projection. We had significant savings, for example, in substitutes this year because of COVID. We weren't in school, so we didn't need substitutes as much. And so we're getting actual ending balance that's greater than the amount of the contingency. That's pretty much normal. So what this is doing is just setting the contingency again at what we set it at last time. And I would expect ultimately by the end of the year, you probably will have an ending balance that's higher than that, I guess is the way I would say it. So, but that's clearly a choice. And if you believe that the reserves should be higher, which many people do, you could budget for a higher reserve. If you believe that that we should draw down the reserve because this is an extraordinary time, you could choose to do that.
So Seth, just to directly address your question. So yes, so this spends down to the $8 million, which was the contingency last year. And then it would still be a $2.5 million shortfall.
Right.
Even after we do that. Now, the contingency of 8 million, Jim, I think is 7%. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's about
Jim?
7. Yeah.
About 7%. And so our threshold per board policy for contingency, it can be set as low as 5%. So just keeping that in mind for the board members or the budget committee members who may be new.
Yeah, the 2.5 is just the difference between these two numbers. So if you want to have a contingency of 8 million and you spend this money here, and this is how much revenue you have, then you've got a $2.5 million shortfall. That's what that is.
And this is general fund only at this point. So Jim will throw us more confusing information after we walk through general fund, and those numbers will look a little bit different after that.
No, I was actually, that's a great question because it's kind of crucial that it's like learning math.
So sorry, one follow-up just to make sure I understand because I'm still a little confused on one aspect. So it shows that 108.5 is the revenue coming in. And then if you look at the first two lines of the requirements, doing math in my head on the fly is dangerous, but I think it adds up to 103 million of expenditures. So if I'm getting 108 and I'm spending 103, shouldn't I be growing my ending balance?
No, because this here is the beginning balance. So your ongoing revenue is only 97.8, and your ongoing spending is that.
I see it now.
Yeah.
So the 108 is not revenue, that's including the beginning balance.
Yeah, it's actually resources, yes. That's why it says, resources over there. Ashley's always yelling at me about that. Okay, so that's the budget box. So this year is maybe unique in some ways in that we have a significant amount of other resources that are available to us. And this is a brief description of what they are. The first is the student investment account. Then the 2019 legislature passed the corporate activities tax, and the district, like all the districts in the state, developed an improvement plan for themselves through a pretty extensive public processes. And for this year, they came up with that plan, and for this year they budgeted $7.6 million, which is basically full funding of what was intended in the student investment account. Unfortunately, the COVID recession lowered it kind of delayed the implementation of the tax and then lowered the revenue to about 2.6 million. So that's the amount that was in the budget for this year to spend to the student investment account. The forecast for next year isn't totally to full funding, but it is 6.1 million, which is a significant increase. And so you'll see many of the things that Melissa we're talking about was how we're now going to implement much of this plan that was made in 2019. The second thing is high school readiness. And this one isn't really an increase this year. In fact, it's a slight decline, or significant, well, somewhat of a decline. But it was what it does represent is the legislature, again, on this, the voters originally approved it, and then the legislature implemented it, of moving significant instructional funding into a grant, in this particular case, dedicated to high school success and career readiness, and increasing the resources for districts to achieve results through a grant fund. And this year, there's 2.4 million in the proposed budget for that. And that represents an increase that sort of started back in, after 2016, but is still continuing as permanent funding within this budget. And then there's ESSER. ESSER is the relief for school districts in the 3 COVID-19 stimulus bills that Congress passed. There were 3 of them, ESSER 1, 2, and 3. ESSER 1 was 1.6 million, which we received this year, and it's largely spent. It was spent a lot on costs to move to really the virtual school, computers, access to the internet, those kinds of things. Anything that we needed to get people involved in the virtual education. ESSER 2 is $7 million, which we received the award earlier this year, and that must be spent by September of 2022. And then lastly, in this latest bill that just passed a few months ago, ESSER 3, we don't have a hard estimate yet, but we expect it to be around $15 million. And that must be spent by September of 2023. And 20% of it must be spent on addressing learning loss. So in this budget, we've included both, all of it really. I've included it all in one, as if it were one grant, even though it's 3. Because it's really all available, well, except for ESSER 1, which is largely spent. Those other 2 are available for spending at any time. They are temporary funds, but the potential use of them is pretty broad. And so it's certainly available as temporary funding through September of 2023. So, and then there's 2 other things I thought I'd mention. Other new sources of revenue. The legislature and the Department of Education have put together a grant program for summer schools in 2021 for this summer. It's actually 4 different grants in here, depending on the kind of summer school you run, and you can actually draw on all of them depending on what you're doing as a district. The allocation to us is pretty large. I don't think most districts would have the capacity to actually use all their allocation, but it is available, and you'll see in this budget plans to spend to do an enhanced summer school in this summer. Some of the grants require a 25% match on the part of the district, but that match can be paid out of ESSER. And so when you see this budget, that's the way it's laid out. And the other one that's new in this time, it's actually an extension of some efforts that the district has done before, but it's moved to a new funding source, is Preschool Promise, which funds early childhood education, pre-kindergarten. It's actually, I think, getting a lot of its revenue out of the corporate activities tax, another activity outside of the student investment account. That's where it is a result of, or a lot of the funding for it is a result of that. So those are the other news sources you'll notice in here. Okay, so the budget assumptions in the superintendent's recommended budget. So we're beginning with the December enrollment forecast as the basic assumption. And the reason for that is that as we did more analysis of where we lost these kids, it was virtually all in the elementary grades. The high schools actually were slightly up. The middle schools were slightly down, and they about canceled each other out. And and it was virtually all in the elementary grades, and 40% were in kindergarten. So what you had was parents just holding their kids back for a year because of the COVID emergency. And so we feel comfortable assuming that 3/4 will return. And we also believe we need to be ready if more show up, because that's certainly a possibility. We're assuming a $9.1 billion state appropriation. I think that's unless something really bad happens in the economy, that's a pretty safe assumption. The other options are probably more on the upside. Of course, as I mentioned before, the reduction of the PERS rates, which is a known fact. And the superintendent is recommending a 2% COLA, $50 health cap increase, and a 1 salary step for staff. And lastly, maintaining the $8 million general fund contingency/reserve. So those are the basic assumptions in all of these tables that you're gonna see. Okay. So here's the recommended budget, highlights of the recommended budget. First of all, under the assumptions I just talked about, we end up with about a $2.5 million shortfall in the general fund. And so in order to maintain that $8 million in contingency, we shift about $2.5 million in salary and benefit costs to ESSER. That's something that's specifically permitted by the laws of ESSER. One of the explicit uses is maintaining staff. Just like all the rest of the federal emergency legislation, as it applied to businesses or anyone else, it was one of the primary uses was to maintain staff. And we have done that despite declining enrollment. Now, that can be a very temporary thing, and it could very well be entirely temporary. As the enrollment stabilizes, then we'll have to right size to whatever it turns out to be, up or down. And I would say right now, based on the assumptions we're using, it could be either one. I'm not even sure what the probabilities are. So this is a temporary covering of staff that ultimately, when it stabilizes, we'll have to right size to whatever the enrollment is. Let's see. And then, as the superintendent has talked about, there are a number of investments that are in this budget. Primarily, they're in the student investment account, but they are in some other places as well. I'm sorry, Melissa, you look like you want to say something. You're muted. Melissa, you're muted.
We still can't hear you, Melissa.
Melissa, you're muted. Oh, okay.
We'll move on. Okay.
Sorry, my computer just kept opening this weird screen and I couldn't get back to you.
Oh, okay. All right. But do you have anything you needed to say?
I was just going to go back. If you can go back to the last screen on ESSER. One of the things one of the things we did not do it's not only that we maintained our teaching staff, but one of the things we didn't do is we didn't reduce our transportation drivers. We didn't reduce food services. We didn't reduce any employees this year. We're really proud of that. One of the things that did was it kept families together and kept resources here locally within the community. But to do that, so there was outgoing cost associated with that because we knew we had smaller numbers, but there also, in order to do that, we needed to do some spending around childcare for folks as well. So maintaining our staff is not just as simple as thinking, well, we didn't cut teachers. It's really looking across all employee groups, and our priority was to not have anyone lose their job during the pandemic.
Thanks, Melissa. Could I ask a question just while we're still on this? When we say as enrollment stabilizes, staff must be right-sized up or down, obviously, but would that right-sized be with the smaller classes at the kindergarten and the first grade that we're looking at? I mean, what counts as, how do you define right-sized?
Well, so one of the things that is interesting is since the student investment account is now getting fully funded, we're seeing a different kind of baseline combination of resources when you think of the general fund and the student investment account. And the resources we're using to reduce those class sizes are from the student investment account. So we anticipate that those dollars, the right sizing would include those smaller class sizes as long as our student numbers were such that we could afford to do that. One of the things we are not going to be able to afford to do in an ongoing way, we can't, we are able to take $2.5 million of ESSER, as Jim was referencing, to close that hole that we have this year. Now, we anticipated, just to be really clear, we anticipated that hole would be $4 million. So, I mean, we knew going into this year that at the end of this year, it was likely that we were going to still have a hole. And so being able to fill that with the ESSER dollars is fantastic for us. The rest of the ESSER dollars, we are trying to focus as much on one-time spending as possible so that we are investing in those things that we're going to be using for a long period of time, but don't have the long-term costs associated with that spending, so that aren't staff related.
Okay, thank you for that. So we hope and anticipate that those smaller class sizes would be sustainable over time. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would say it this way, which is that when you do have an increase in permanent funding through the student investment account, and that creates the additional funding to get to the smaller class size. That's not going to go away. If you have fewer students, then you don't need as many classes to be at an 18 class size. And so that's what right sizing means to me. Okay. So investments. Elementary instructional coaches and counselors that Melissa talked about. There are 2 middle school librarians, an expansion of the AOS alternative high school to 9th and 10th grade, expansion of pre-kindergarten programming, and partly through the Preschool Promise grant that I talked about, kindergarten and first grade class sizes of 18, increased behavioral support and assistance, partnerships with organizations to improve mental health support, conflict resolution, and equity training, an equity director, 2 modular units to expand capacity and permit social distancing. That's out of ESSER funds. elimination of sports participation fees, expanded summer school enrichment and remediation programs, a new transportation facility we can talk about. The other thing in this budget is this will be the last year on the contracting side to complete the bond projects. There is some set aside for the following year for internal staff to do some more projects. And I think one of the things that I talk about in there is you know, they did some people, the people that worked on it, the people that and the people that helped pay for it, the taxpayers, really should get out and look and see what's been accomplished by these bond projects. And then there's a new budget director in the budget, which you need to have a new budget director. So I think those are the things, and there are questions. There are a few things I'd like to point out in the tables when that time comes. But I think this is a good time for questions.
All right. So it looks like you probably are on mute unless you take yourself off, as I learned the hard way. Questions for Jim?
Were those ESSER funds, were they included in that first chart that you showed us, or no?
No, the first chart was totally general fund. And I did put the dollar amounts on each of the charts that were for that particular grant fund. So there's about $22 million in the budget in ESSER funds. Not all of it is planned to be spent this year. There's about $6 million in the student investment account, and 2.5 or so in high school readiness.
What's the time frame on the ESSER funds? How long do we have to spend those?
So it's real easy to remember. ESSER 2 is September of 2022, and ESSER 3 is September of 2023.
Okay.
So it's like a gift to budget directors, like easy to remember.
Jim, could you bring up the first slide of the investments? I have a couple of questions regarding the investments. I'd like to just go through those slides again.
What did I do? I closed the window. How do I get it open again? There we go. And now I've got to get it back up here. And so you have to, right, there we go. So is that the first one?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Thank you. Oh, there we go. Love the expansion of AOS. That's a need that we've heard that there is. Do we anticipate that AOS can expand to accommodate 9th and 10th graders in its current facility?
Yeah, so we do anticipate that it could, not how the facility is currently occupied though, because as you know, we have FACT there in the Welcome Center. We have a whole bunch of employees who are residing there, providing services to students. So the expansion of AOS would need to be part of a planned expansion where we would find an alternative home for folks in Welcome Center and FACT, and looking at some of our other spaces. So one of the things we know is we want to keep them centrally located because it's really important for our families to be able to access those services. Yeah. So we would really be looking at all of our schools, what space is available to them, how well utilized they are by their current, by the current configurations, whether there are other schools. I look at Central and Tahkeena, and we may see some opportunity there Takina has obviously has space for another wing that just hasn't been built yet. So we definitely have some rearranging we can do. And that's what would need to happen for us to expand OS.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please.
Oops, wrong mouse. Nope.
You're right. Modular units, where are we thinking about placing those?
So I'm not sure if Assistant Superintendent Harlan is still here, but yep, there you go.
Yeah, it's sometimes I turn my camera off when there's someone sharing their screen because my computer doesn't like that. But so right now we're trying to prioritize modulars. We're actually a bit worried, to be honest, about space next year, given that we know in elementary school that the kindergarten class coming in will likely be the biggest class we've ever seen, because 40% of our kindergartners this year didn't come in. And right now in the district, our biggest class is our 4th grade class. There is just a bubble there for some reason. So we know in elementary next year, they'll have 2 big ones, kinder and 5th grade. So right now, the priority for those modulars is elementary. Looking at Waverly, I know there were 4 that we were discussing most immediately. The problem that everyone should be aware about is just the permitting and the purchasing of modulars. It's not quick, either of those things. And so space will be a factor next year. I know we're looking at Waverly, Nays, South Shore, and there was one other that is slipping my mind right now.
We had a couple of different ideas about Takina.
Yeah.
And on both of these questions, on any question regarding space, I assume that Fir Grove is still in the mix of consideration. Yeah.
Yep, Fir Grove and the space that's left at Clover in terms of how to utilize all of the available space and yeah, what that looks like.
Okay, thank you. And next slide, please. Okay, so is a budget director different than a finance director? No.
No, that's
Okay.
the same position.
Okay, but we had thought that we would hire a budget director / finance director this year. So how is the funding for that position different going forward than what it's been this year?
So this is a comparison of budget over budget. So formally in the budget last year, or this year, I guess I should say, in the budget this year, there wasn't another position in that budget. It was a decision that was made through the year. So it wasn't really in that budget. And so now it's formally recognized in the budget.
That's true. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
All right, Eric.
So I'm not trying to stir the pot too much, but when we talk about adding modulars, and I know the superintendent, assistant superintendent talked about, the modular at Clover, we haven't reboundaried for a while. That's always a scary conversation for a lot of people. But I know that, we've had conversations of looking at that. Is that kind of on Mrs. Goff's 2-3 year radar right now?
Yes, and unfortunately, we're going to see the bubble before we're going to be able to work through a zoning process. So this, the urgency that is created by those kinders staying out and that 5th and kinder bulge is part of the challenge for next year. But yes, so we remember we started that work last year with Shannon before the pandemic, and so that work will get picked right back up, and we'll pick that up in the fall to have those conversations. Certainly, we have had some questions around that just with regards to certain schools and where some homes are being built, and where folks who end up moving into those homes, what school they will go into. And so those conversations are always ongoing. But as far as a boundary change, that is more of a 2 to 3 year conversation. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it.
I had 2 quick questions. Jim, if you can go back 1 slide on the investments. So the second to last bullet there around elimination of sports participation fees, is that just a one-time budget thing, or is that planned to be going forward forever, that the fees would go away?
I believe it's permanent, but I think
Yeah, so that's part of the student investment account dollars. So that's part of what
Okay.
we are envisioning going forward for as long as those dollars exist.
Okay. And then my other question is related both to the first bullet on this page and then the bullet on the page right before this around mental health supports. I think the other one was phrased as behavioral supports. Can you talk a little bit of what that means? We already talked about elementary school and having counselors in each school, but what does that mean as far as behavioral health supports?
Assistant Superintendent Harlan, I see you teeing up to answer. Thank you.
Yeah, so for behavioral supports specifically, we were looking at on the bus. So transportation supports, one of the things that we hear often is it's just the bus driver and there isn't another adult on the bus. So part of that behavioral support is that. And then the mental health supports, that's really contracting to get additional therapists at the secondary schools. So when you see those 2 things, it's elementary counselors, it's therapists at the high schools and the middle schools through contracts, and behavioral supports for transportation.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, what other questions? None? Any other discussion about the information presented? Okay. This may be a record if we don't have any other questions. So, Jim, I'm not sure if that's kudos to you or not. So we'll take that as a positive.
Good point.
Superintendent Goff, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to add, well, that's what happens when you actually have good news, where you're super excited and able to make investments. So many of these things, as Jim was going through the list again of investments, for me, I've just never seen us be able to, with confidence, take a look at such a diverse set of investments that really start to get us footing in areas that I know will make a difference for kids. When I look at something that says our K-1 class size is at 18, that's insanely wonderful to think about. And so hopefully the silence is because people are in shock and awe at being able to see investments on the budget like that.
I think, shoot, I just had a question and left. So if there aren't any other, I'm sorry, was there a comment?
Yeah, I was just going to say the one thing I would add too about these investments, and I know some of the folks on the board will remember this. This was the product of a year or more's worth of community conversations and forums and going out to different focus groups, and was really a labor of love for those of us in curriculum and instruction, to the point where we had taken all of this information from the community, families, from students themselves, created this plan that we were so excited about, that really took a lot of work. And then I want to say it was the next day after it was due, or 2 days after, that we got word that it wouldn't be funded. And so there was this sense of so much hope that was just dashed so dramatically. So just know that for a lot of folks, especially the student investment account, that the time and the effort that went into making a really good plan, it's so exciting to see some of this be able to be kind of reinvigorated and kind of come to fruition, because man, there was just such excitement that was dashed almost immediately days after with just such despair. So I know for a lot of people in the community and a lot of people who did the work on this plan, there's a lot of just gratitude and excitement to be able to see some of these things come to life. So to take—
Lisa, I was going to bring that up, that the last time we felt this excited was 2 years ago when the SIA funds first started, getting approved and coming through. And then you're right, it was just dashed. And that's why I wasn't going to say anything, because I don't want to jinx it.
I was a part of that strategic planning group, and the work that was put into kind of looking at the needs of the community and going through the data that was pulled from the surveys that were done that year. I feel like this budget really reflects what the community said they wanted, or what the community was saying they needed. So I can really see this reflected in the budget. And so, yeah, I really, I don't have any questions, because I'm like, okay, I know the needs. And I see how you were really thoughtful in how you could address those and do it in a way that I think is going to have a really big impact on our district.
So as the committee continues having their discussions, I'd like to bring your attention to the chat where the actual budget document has been posted and shared with you, as well as it's also been sent through your emails.
Great. Thank you very much.
So they
Ashley.
don't have the actual tables yet? Okay.
They do now.
Okay, you do now. So when you look at those tables, I mean, a lot of them are ones that are required and they're useful. There is one that's a little different than if you've looked at these budget before. On page 23 and 24, I was just looking at it, where I combined the general fund with the SIA, high school readiness, and ESSER into one table, so that you see the combined spending of all four of them together. And I think that kind of paints a pretty good picture of the increases in investments in the budget. And when you look at any one of them, you know, there's always shifting going on between them, and it confuses the story a little bit. So
what page is that on, Jim?
I think it's 23 and 24 in the, and there is one other difference in that table. The way the law requires, normally you have to put your tables in where it says, this is the budget that we had for this year. This is the proposed budget for next year. So you're always comparing budget to budget. That table, as sort of an extra table, is actually comparing the operational level we were at especially in SIA, because it was much lower funded this year compared to where it would be under the proposed budget. So it gives you a better comparison of reality to reality than comparing just budget to budget, because the budget, we couldn't actually implement the way it was passed because the revenue didn't show up.
And so you see that in particular, because staffing is 90% of our funding. You see that in particular when you look at the staffing numbers, which is another detail that we didn't have down to those codes in the past in our budget. So you'll see those populated staffing numbers as well, which gives you kind of a feel for where those investments ended up.
Right. That's one thing the system allowed, was that if you look at your past budgets, it didn't have FTE in the main tables. There were tables in the back that had FTE in, but they didn't necessarily exist in the detail that it existed in those tables.
I did have one follow-up question going back to the initial part of the presentation around the contingency ending balance fund. I know that the assumption in there was 8 million, which it sounds like is a higher percentage than we're required to, at least from a minimum percentage. I know the budget committee has gone through many conversations around what's the right amount. So I wasn't sure if at this point we're recommending the 8 million or if we need to take a different look at it from the budget committee standpoint to figure out what we want to balance to, and when we want to have that conversation.
So I appreciate you asking that. And I just would like to say I'd love to hear the opinions of committee members tonight. If you kind of feel like you know enough to have an opinion before you get in a little bit deeper into the budget. Because this really does look at that $2.5 million backfill happening out of ESSER and not out of the contingency fund, but an option for you as a budget committee is to instead say, well, we're more comfortable spending down our contingency by a point and having those ESSER dollars in case in the fall we run into another pandemic emergency and we need additional funds that are easy and quick to use. So without having to bring the committee together again.
Any thoughts on that, or?
My complete knee-jerk reaction is that last year, despite the pandemic, we actually went well. You know, our fund ended. It appears it'll end much higher than we budgeted. So it feels like there's enough of a cushion there to manage. At least we've done it before. So I don't think we need to do extra contingency upon a contingency, in my view.
I think my preference would be to use the ESSER funds as have been proposed, only because since I've been on the budget committee, we've also really had to go into that, I think, multiple years, even when in theory we had a little better times than we've had the last 18 months. So that would be my preference, but a longer conversation about what's the right amount to have. Clearly, it's served us well here because of some of the challenges that we've had, but I can also see a point where we don't have money in the bank when there's student needs that need to be met now, because in 5 years, those kids are not in the school system, depending on how old they are, anymore, and we've missed that opportunity. Any other thoughts on that? Okay. Any other questions or discussion about the budget? Justin.
I just got a quick one, and I know we probably don't want to get into the weeds of this right now, but when you talk about the possible investment in online education, I noticed the Albany Online, the dedicated fees towards that, or budget towards that doesn't change. So where would we see that increase in investment in online learning and for kids who thrive this year?
So you see that in the already existing staffing numbers. So what we've done right now is we've reallocated staffing based on teachers follow kids, right? So the staffing numbers still exist within the budget and don't need to show up elsewhere because they're in the middle school instructional, the elementary instructional, et cetera.
So it will be run more or less through the schools?
It won't. It'll be a district-led program. It'll be a district-run program next year. So this year it's still run through the schools primarily, except for in a very few cases. And but next year we anticipate that it will be much smaller. We believe that more of our students will be going to school in person. So it will be district assigned, but the teachers will come out of the schools if the school enrollment is lower, right? Because those students were somewhere else before. They were in, let's use Clover Ridge as a non-threatening example. They were at Clover Ridge, but then they decided instead they want to be in distance learning rather than going to school in person at Clover Ridge. So now Clover Ridge has 25 fewer first graders. That means that we reassign that staffing then to the distance learning at the district level for first grade.
Okay.
It won't happen that neatly. It won't happen that neatly for us, but yeah.
Do we anticipate our numbers for AOL changing at all because of the pandemic and and more students going back to school, perhaps?
Yes, perhaps. And remember, we did the same thing. So we've assigned classroom teachers to AOL as well. So we also have some of those classroom teachers that are there, and they'll swing back. We anticipate they'll swing back into regular classrums.
Okay, thank you.
Right. The budget assumes that. And if more show up at AOL, then that's there's a lot of risk involved coming into this next year about not knowing where kids are going to be. And I think ESSER is there for that. And if 200 kids show up at AOL instead of the normal 100, then there's a resource there to deal with that. And part of it is shifting teachers over there if that makes sense, because not enough showed up in the brick and mortar school. It's the same thing that they did this year. We did this year.
How is CDL different from Albany Online?
That's a great question. So Albany Online is a different curriculum, and it's a curriculum using national standards, and it uses K-12 ed, and it's largely self-paced, right? So it truly is kind of an online learning. So I could do it if I was a competitive athlete, if I had just a different schedule, I could do it at night, I could do it on the weekends. CDL has more synchronous opportunities with teachers where you're just learning kind of virtually, but you have a set time that you have to get on and a teacher that walks you through different content areas. So allow for virtual learning, but it's a very different setup.
Right. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions? Eric?
So the legislators this year were looking at changing the percentages on students that can leave their district to go to like charter schools. So I think it's a 3% standard. I don't know if that has gone through or it's still proposed or the bill died.
I'm not sure, but I know that 3% cap still remains for districts who are able to offer more than one online option, which we are. So I anticipate that cap will still be in effect for next year.
Okay. Jennifer?
There we go. I just want to underscore what Heather and Lisa said earlier, which is, noting how this budget, and especially investments that we're making, is tied to the strategic planning and to the feedback that we got from our community. And so just speaking to the budget committee as a whole, as you're probably aware, 3 of us are cycling off the board. And I think when we got that feedback from our community about how they want us to invest in their students, that wasn't just for this year, for 1 year, that should guide us for several years. And I would just make an appeal to this committee to hold the district to that, and to continue to go back to rely on the feedback that we got from our people, and make sure that the way that we're spending and allocating our money aligns with what our community has said to us. And that's going to be an ongoing challenge, and I just hope that you'll continue to do that.
Excellent point, Jennifer. One of the things that and I know I don't know that we have any comments from the public. Jennifer, I think this afternoon you said there wasn't any. Is that still correct?
That's still correct.
Okay. I think to your point though, Jennifer, engaging the community in both the criteria and the whole process that we are involved with, but more importantly, in the investments that we make through this budgeting process is critical. And I know I've talked to Superintendent Goff about this, but I think one of the challenges I've seen in my years of being on this committee is getting public involvement. And I think the more you can involve people, the more they are invested in, no pun intended, in what the budget process is, but also what those dollars are funding in our school district. And so any ways that we can do that as a committee, I'm all for. I think Superintendent Goff, you had some ideas around some involvement in other forums, and I'm happy to have you talk about that if you're ready to.
Yeah, I appreciate that opportunity to do that. So we have a couple forums that are coming up where I think it would be it would behoove budget committee members to be sharing what you've learned about the budget and listening to the community members as well. One of the forums that we have is next week, and I'm having it with students, and in that forum, we're actually having a facilitated conversation that our 2 student board members are facilitating. And the entire point is just, what should the superintendent know that you don't think she does, or she needs to be real clear on, or so it's really just an open talk. And what are your concerns? What things are you concerned about within our schools? What would make you feel safer in our schools? What would make you feel more supported? And so that conversation is going to be shaped next week. And that might be one that we think about, how could we have some budget committee members listening in on rather than speaking to just hear what comes from students, to kind of do a gut check around what you hear from students, and recognizing that a lot of kids on there participate at their own with their own nervousness and not wanting to be exposed by participating in that conversation. We want to make it a really safe space for participants. And perhaps the committee members who would want to participate in that might be a couple board members to listen, just because they're kind of covered by the confidentiality components of leadership within the school district. And then the other one, though, is we have 2 meetings, both the same night, one in English and the other in Spanish, with our families. And those are scheduled maybe, I don't have it in front of me and I apologize, but I will get it before you end the meeting officially. The second week in May. And they're back to back. One is at 6 and the other is at 7. And
The 11th, Tuesday the 11th.
Bless you. Thank you. So Tuesday, May 11th. And we actually have our English speaking parents first by design, because our Spanish speaking families, because I don't speak Spanish, Assistant Superintendent Harlan does speak Spanish, which is a great asset for us. But in order to make sure that all of our native Spanish speakers can participate as fully as our English speakers, and we can do translation and interpretation, we like to have more time for our Spanish speaking families. So the first meeting, I believe, what time is it at? 6. It's at 6. I know that. English, 7 o'clock Spanish, and the 7 o'clock may run an hour and a half rather than an hour. And that would be great for particularly those budget committee members. For those of you who are community members, those 2 meetings would really be especially fantastic for you to be a part of. And what would be ideal is if one of you and I, or one of you and Jim, talked a little bit in advance around hitting a couple of those slides and some of the key information to be able to share with families what this budget investment looks like and how those dollars work together.
Okay. I think that would be a fantastic opportunity. I would certainly be happy to, but if there's others that would like to join me, or I'm not sure if we want to have 12 of us there, probably not. All right. Other questions? All right. I think we mentioned already there are no comments from the public. Hopefully we'll do our jobs really well on May 11th, and there'll be lots of comments next time. Any requests for information from the committee at this time? Oh, Russ, go ahead.
Just a process comment. As everyone's digging into the budget, undoubtedly questions are going to come up. And from speaking with Ashley and Sully about past practice, the easiest way to get those addressed is just to email those directly to Jim and me. And then we will develop the answers on those and roll them into a FAQ and have that available for you before the next board or the next budget committee meeting.
Okay. And when would you like those questions? Is there a deadline that you'd like to have those so you're not getting them an hour before the meeting?
I'm looking at Ashley to see what the norm has been. But I think if we had a couple of days working on them ahead of time, we should be fine.
Okay.
And I would just add to that, those will then be presented to the public, available for the public to see the answers to those questions as well, in case folks are wondering if they'll get to know that info.
Okay. Great. And our next scheduled meeting per the calendar that you all approved is May 12th, which is a day after those two parent forums. So ideally we get those, the 12th is a Wednesday, so ideally get those by no later than Monday, and preferably well before that, to give staff a chance to respond back in their usual eloquent fashion. All right.
10th, 9th, 8th, 7th. May I ask if we could have those by the end of the day on May 7th, just so that staff can prepare their responses and turn them back around to you in advance of the meeting, so you can read those responses in advance of the meeting.
Sure. Yes, and I think budget members get extra credit if you get them in well before that. So there's usually a prize for the first question.
They'll double their pay.
Yeah. Yeah, donuts for everyone. All right, well, if there's no other questions, thank you very much for everybody's time this evening. Again, some really good news on the budget. I'm excited to dig into some of the details. Thank you for all the work that went into this. I'm sure we'll all have questions because it's a little different format than some of us that have done this for a few years are used to seeing, but I'm sure that we will get used to it quickly. So unless there is anything else, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Great job facilitating us. Night, guys.